Hello, everyone. Welcome to Interabang Chats. Today, I'm really happy to have with us my good friend, the poet Tess Taylor, and she's here to talk with us about two books of hers that were published this year, two poetry books, Rift Zone, and also the volume Last West, which is in conjunction with an exhibit at the New York Museum of Modern Art of the photography of Dorothea Lange. Welcome, Tess.
Hi, Lori. It's so great to be here. Really good to see you.
Good to see you too. So tell us, uh, I think your books were published in March and April of this year. Is that correct?
February and April, yeah.
Okay. And I'm assuming it wasn't necessarily the plan to have both books come out so close to each other, and certainly not the plan for them to come out when the world kind of shut down as we know it. So tell me kind of like which one was conceived first, and especially how your collaboration with the museum formed and took place.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a really weird spring because I had this build up to this moment of these two books coming out in synergy, and they actually launched into this strange moment. The first book that I've been working on actually for about a decade is Rift Zone, and it was actually published second, but I've been working on it for longer. I grew up in the Bay Area and had left there in the late 90s and came back 10 years ago. And I ended up thinking a lot about fault lines and about the land in California and the urge to come home. So many things had changed. There was an internet now, there was this global economy, the housing prices had skyrocketed. I had just become a mother, and I was on this beautiful, ancient, hyper-modern slab of land facing the Pacific, and these poems came together. They're kind of about fracturing and about a place that's fracturing, and you know, California is literally full of fissures in the soil where the land is actually tearing apart under the continental plates. But that feeling of being torn and tearing, I think, is an American feeling right now. And so I always try to tell a story that's hyper local, but also like would have resonance for the wider world. And so I'm writing these poems, I'm walking around the neighborhood that I grew up in, and early on I make this discovery that the photographer Dorothea Lange, who many people know for her photographs of the Great Depression and people in tents and Okies coming out of Texas and the Panhandle, and you know, moving to California in the 30s and 40s for work, she photographed that whole wave and that great migration. But she also photographed the neighborhood that I grew up in. And it's a neighborhood of small, sensible bungalows. It is a neighborhood of the new California and the middle class dream. It is a neighborhood where like a tiny postcard plot of land with a lemon tree. It's really a dreamy, little, humble, sweet spot. And she had photographed that as kind of the end point of all of this travel and a place of hopefulness. And at the same time that she did those photographs, she was also photographing Japanese internment that was also happening, people being pulled out of this very same neighborhood and being interned. So she had this incredible micro history of my place. She knew things about it, but also like, doesn't every artist want to walk around a neighborhood thinking about the way that a different artist also saw it? I mean, if you're in Paris, you're thinking about all the artists that saw Paris. And I happen to live in a town called El Cerrito, California, and there aren't that many artists who've made beautiful things here. And so when I found out that Dorothea Lange had been here and had seen it with tenderness and interest, I got really fascinated. And I started looking at all her photos, and I found her archive at the Oakland Museum. And somehow my interest in this work got to the ears of a curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and she said, "I love your poems. What are you writing? Can we work on something?" And her exhibition at Museum of Modern Art was called Dorothea Lange, Words and Pictures. And for those of you that are at home and looking for something to do, it's still available online as a virtual view. You can go and see the whole exhibition. I think I even like talk a little bit on that as well. And it's kind of amazing, actually, the quality that they put together. So what I did for the book Last West, the other book, was I took Dorothea Lange's road notebooks from the 1930s and 40s. She would say the towns that she went to. She would make notes of people, what they said on the side of the road. And she was an incredible note taker. And I followed that same route and drove around California. And I also took notes. And so I wove together, it's like a collage poem of her voices that she gathered in the 1930s and voices I overheard in the same towns now.
And she was in your part of the country, I think, like around 1935. Is that right? When she was taking
Yeah.
some photographs. And I wanted to ask you, because in one of the places early on, it might even be the first page or one of the first pages, you talk about her scrawl. And so when you were looking at her notes, I mean, were they easy to decipher, or did you have to kind of interpret a lot of it?
Her notes were like photocopies. She had these 3x5 spiral ring notebooks, and then she would kind of put them in envelopes. And then later, the Museum of Oakland photocopied all of the notebook pages. And I think they have them somewhere deep, deep, deep in an archive. And then in the 1970s, some very eager and passionate graduate student typed up a version of them that I could follow. They have this staccato list-making feeling, and they're all about like the price of onions, the price of gas, and like these sad little stories that felt very relevant, like I wouldn't undertake to farm this land no more, or this country's a hard country. When you die, you're dead. That's all. And that's a piece of vernacular she actually picked up on the Texas Panhandle. And it captions a picture of a woman in distress. So it was partly that she had this incredible eye for detail and this incredible ear for language. I just thought, and she'd gotten so many people to speak to her, and the things that they were concerned about where their next paycheck was coming from, and whether they could make rent, and whether their work was going to be enough to cover the cost of their life. Felt like things that we're all really thinking about, and that felt really relevant to the conversations that we're having today.
So did you feel like you were responding to the photographs, or did you feel more maybe like you were supplementing or putting more context into them?
It's interesting because the book has photographs in it. Like this is a Dorothea Lange, and then here's that coastline, and here's one of an encampment. They're not the iconic ones that you might have seen if you've seen Migrant Mother, which is that Florence Owens Thompson, holding her head beside a tent with her children around her. That they aren't those. The way that I like to think of it is that I used Dorothea Lange as a lens. She was a photographer, but I used her as a lens for looking at California now. And so, for instance, in the 1930s in the Imperial Valley, she would drive 12 to 15 hours from Berkeley, California, and then she would go and photograph carrot pickers in Holtville for the carrot harvest. And she would photograph the migrant laborers coming to pick carrots. And literally on some of the fields that she photographed, there's now actually a different form of our relation to migrants, which is a detention center that has 782 beds. And there's a whole economy around border crossing and border security that is, it's a very, very poor county. Coronavirus cases are spiking right now. It's got some of the highest poverty in the country. It's not the California that people think of when they think of like rich white liberals. It is dry and dusty and in need. And but the fact that like underneath that same detention center was a site that she had seen all of these other migrant laborers coming out of, the Dust Bowl. It was just the relationship of those things to one another felt really poignant to me, and it felt like something that if we held those images of America in tension, that we might open our hearts a little bit.
And then your other book to come out this year, Rift Zone, which is all 100% Tess Taylor. It is a very, I guess I was struck by the way that it is performing on so many levels. Of course, you can tell by the title, and because that California is on a fault, that we're talking a little bit about geography and topography and things, but it also gets very much into society and social issues. And I think one of my favorite poems, and maybe I'll get you to read that one for us, is sixth grade, 1988.
Oh, yeah.
Which talks about a school shooting. And I wondered, is this something that you're coming at from personal experience, or just kind of things that you were reading and seeing in the news?
No, so the year 1988, it was the year that I was in sixth grade at Harding Elementary here in El Cerrito, California. And it was also the year of the Stockton Massacre. And that was really the first very big school shooting. And it was really the first moment that people said, we won't let this ever happen again. This is horrifying. We're, we will not, this is really bad. But it was also the year that a girl that I knew well and had a kind of friendship with brought a gun to school, and she threatened us. She threatened a different group of sixth graders, and she was somebody kind of backed out and got someone's attention, and she was taken off the field, and later her backpack was removed, which had the gun in it, and we never saw her again. And so later, going through some really goofy photos of playing with a kid's camera and taking photos at funny angles, I found a photo of that day, or not that day, of that year, and I saw her, and I just remembered how much I liked her, and how she was this really bright, sort of snappy kid, and this was this hauntingly mysterious thing that had happened. And it's funny, those things from your childhood that you don't necessarily remember remembering, but then when you do call them up, you puzzle over them, and you try to decode, what did I learn then, or what happened? So I will read that poem. This thing about, we're all from places and childhoods, and I had the unusual chance to come back to the place I grew up in, and you can never really see it the same way. I mean, you've learned a lot, and you read it differently, and so there's a kind of quality of making sense of, like, what the fuck was that, so there's that element as well. One of the rifts in Rift Zone is definitely the rift in time. Sixth grade, 1988. No one explained the reasons Dana found that spring to bring her brother's gun to school, triggers that led her to threaten to shoot you bitches. We were nubbly by the morning glories, hadn't scattered different ways. We were playing tetherball. I remember Sierra Birch's thin legs running, a shrill voice yelling, "Call the teacher." In high noon California sun, Dana's palm was shaking, her face tight with fear or anger. In dream time, big men came to cuff her, and I heard her whimper, saw her lean girl's body fall. This year, I found a photograph. Dana and her friend Manon mug for my frame. Mischievous grins split baby cheeks, ponytails bustle in the wind. It came back like a rusty fountain, a smell of chalk and sixth grade funk. We were learning fractions. That day we watched her disappear, heard the big door shut, the silence after. Decades floated over all our bodies. All the schools have drills for guns now. None of this names how it feels to look back 30 years and find this odd remainder, bright and on the verge of life, as if we are yet unhurt. There's Dana, smiling.
Really makes you feel the loss of innocence.
Yeah, I mean, it was a rough school district in a lot of ways, and a lot of people had lost a lot of innocence early. It's a school district that can't afford to make any modifications to reopen right now. And, you know, I'm thinking about all those kids and what's going to happen to them this year, and where we're going to work to find equity later. You know, was this just something that we're deferring? But yeah, it's a big sprawling district over an industrial city and, you know, a couple suburbs. And so anyway, yeah. I think it's funny, I've run into other people that I wrote about in this book. I named some people, Noah Zolis-Levy and Katie Bolton-Schmuckler show up in a different poem. And both of them have found me and been like, why did you put me in a poem? Because I remember you, I remember your name, I remember our story.
I was wondering when I read that poem whether they were real people, because the names are kind of distinctive. You know, like I went to school with people named John Smith and Tony Davis, and those are more I'd say colorful names. So I wasn't sure whether they were real people or not.
So we had these Berkeley parents, and in some ways these Berkeley parents wanted to tell us that they had solved a lot of stuff for us. Like they had demonstrated against racism, and they were fighting sexism, and they were entering the workforce, and they desegregated the schools. And we grew up on this cusp of being told that it was getting better and had gotten better, and then that we were going to be on the trajectory of that, but we also had to work really hard. But, you know, they were also people who, I think the thing about Noah Zolis-Levy and Katie Bolton-Schmuckler is it always occurred to me that if they did get married, we hadn't solved the problem for them. Like the future of like that kind of hyphenated name thing. And
Right.
It wasn't but I don't think, I mean, I hope show up like, hi guys. But just an example of sort of this weird way that Berkeley liberals kind of hadn't sorted it out, or like they left us this world that has gone on being really baffling and troubling and confusing and violent. And I think there's something about being in this generation of kind of inheriting half of a finished project and looking at it and being like, oh yeah, but that's a mess too, you know?
Yeah. Well, I was when I was thinking about talking to you today, I was thinking how to someone like me, poetry is almost a foreign language. I feel like when I'm reading poetry versus prose, it feels almost like I'm reading in such a different way, or forcing my mind to think in such a different way that it feels it just feels different, and it takes a while to get into the rhythm of things. I guess I wanted to understand, as a poet, and I've never tried to write poetry. Where do you start? Like, to me, I've never written any creative writing. Well, maybe I guess back in high school, some very horrible short stories or something. But you know, in prose, it seems kind of self-explanatory. There's a plot, and then you're expounding from there. How do you, as a poet and as an artist, kind of approach your work?
I mean, I think poetry begins also with the permission to write poetry. I think I was talking to the poet Sharon Olds, who's fabulous and has a Pulitzer, and she just talked about, you know, keeping notebooks with very low stakes, knowing that she was writing poems that she might never come back to, that they were totally allowed to be terrible and bad. And so then you're very permissive to your instincts. And for me, sometimes it's the presence of a strange voice, a little, here's another figure for the rift, a little tear in the day. I'll find myself thinking about a spider or fungi, and just letting a little thought cloud develop. And sometimes that thought cloud is sort of topical, and sometimes it's musical. And for me, the poem really announces itself, particularly with its music. I'll definitely have ideas. I write, you know, nonfiction as well, and I write essays, and sometimes, but a poem will sometimes da 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 da, and I feel the thing, and then there's a little, and then it just kind of announces itself a little bit by like tapping. It sort of taps at the window of the mind, and I've learned to just try to trust that, and not necessarily try to announce that that's the finished thing, or that it's a book or an idea. I always just let the little tendrils kind of climb up. And, you know, here my notebooks are behind me. And then eventually I go back through the notebooks and start to see how the things that have been coming out might align. And then there's a little bit more scaffolding. So for instance, I knew that I wanted to write about coming home to California. That was just very much on my mind the whole time. And so I did that, but I didn't know what it was going to be. I didn't know that like it was going to be earthquakes. I didn't, you sort of just have to trust that something's going to emerge little by little.
And so you said that you were working on this, I guess, more than 10 years or about 10 years here and there.
Yeah.
And so is it the case that if we were to look at your notebooks that there would have been like a lot of material that you didn't use? And how did you decide, because there are so many poems in here of a different sort, you know, landscape and topography, and then the social thing, and then also very personal. There's a beautiful poem here, I think in honor of your husband, another one for your little girl. So were you coming at it that you wanted some kind of preset mix of these kind of different influences, or was it a little bit more organic than that?
I knew, I mean, these were the years that I became a mother. And this is a very weird time to try to convey optimism and hope, and to try to tell small mammals what you think the world should be like. The world has been very, very violent and dangerous and heartbreaking, you know, for years. And so the weird thing where you're kind of playing the duty of absorbing that information, but also trying to create a space in which something really tender can grow. That was a paradox that was just kind of played over my heartstrings a lot. And so that kind of thread got woven in. And then there was exactly that, like the love of landscape and these beautiful trees. I mean, we have a redwood tree in the backyard, and also, you know, there are these incredible beings that can live for 2,000 years and have this ecosystem that has so much to teach us about how to survive, and is itself a record of like fire and water and rain and, you know, species. And so that was part of it, like awe and beauty were part of it. And then I think the feeling of this fracture and the feeling of like going over some old histories of childhood and like the then and now, that was also part of it. But those constellations just emerged. I mean, there's moments when I wouldn't know. And I think you sort of have to blunder forward for a while. And there's a book in here called The Roadside Geology of California that keeps getting quoted. And that's funny because it was really hilarious. Just yesterday, I was over at my parents' house and I ran into my dad, and he has this rock that we picked up at this beach. It's got like sandstone and different shells in it. It's really cool looking. And my dad just like went into this kind of like micro lecture about geology. And he was always like trying to tell us how the land had been made. And so the feeling of loving science and loving topography and thinking that this is incredible, that we live on the edge of the continent, and then below us is this trench, and there's these currents coming from Alaska, and they're coming up from Mexico. And the way that a poem can kind of encapsulate, or a book of poems can move between those scales. And I think I started to feel that the experiment in moving between scales at which we exist, right? Like as a parent, as a political being, as a very small being in long geologic time, you know, as a tiny figure underneath the entire bank of fog that's like already ridden 1,000 miles from Alaska. I think the feeling of compressing those things next to each other started to feel really exciting to me.
Yeah. And I think that one impression that I got from reading the volume was, and you know, California, El Dorado, it's this, you know, myth maker in the American psyche. And it is such a territory of great beauty and kind of awe-inspiring. And at the same time, when you're talking about the detention centers, and it also has just like most of America, a very violent history and also violent present as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting where I live. You know, I just mentioned my redwood tree. There's actually a buried stream where they buried it to build the suburb. But if you stand on that land and you think 250 years, you're thinking Ohlone, Spain, Mexico, contested territory in a really long land dispute, finally the US. And it's also attractive land that partly became available to build on because of Japanese internment, because people were forcibly removed, and there was this crazy land grab then as well. And so it's, you know, on the one hand, it's a very unassuming place. And on the other hand, under it is this core sample of violence, you know, that made the apparently bland surface possible. And, you know, for me, also behind me is an upthrust rock that used to be the bottom of the sea. And it's this piece of blue schist. And it's like a big, you know, gaping piece of hillside. And that is also the product of a kind of violence, which is the violence of geology. And so I think just kind of coming to understand that I was thinking of these things in terms of each other, nature and culture, like sort of interwoven in that way. I was like, oh, okay, this is where the book is. And that's when I sort of started to follow that.
Now, you told me, I think, or mentioned that like any author that's coming out with a new book, you had big plans in 2020 for an author tour. Did you say like 42 cities and 3 countries or something like that?
Totally. This week I would have just been done teaching in Paris. I was going to read in Edinburgh. I was invited to read in Northern Ireland, which is cool because Seamus Heaney is a poet I love, and I had an affiliation with the Seamus Heaney Center, and yeah, all over the country. In fact, you know, hopefully coming to you and book people and coming, just, I mean, so many things that I want. Every week is still a calendar of would have beens, and probably will be until, I mean, I was booked out till October or November. So it's super weird because I wrote this book of poems, 2 books of poems that are really about place. And now I have no option but to be in this place, you know, to really, I have actually, you know, planted 4 blueberry bushes, like put in a different fig tree. I am, I am very attentive to the quality of my soil right now. I mean, quite literally. So it's just, it's really, it, and it's also funny because I wrote this books of poems actually about sort of violence and precarity and like there but for fortune and we're all on the brink. And then as the books launched, there was this pandemic and I was like, oh my gosh, we're more on the brink than even the poems knew. Like
We may have fallen over the brink. I'll
we're beyond the brink.
I'll share something with the viewers, and I've felt pretty inconsiderate last week, and like that I should have thought of this, but the store did a pre-order campaign with Tess for both of these books, and you know, and then everything went crazy and months pass, and we had talked about doing this chat together today, and Tess emailed me and said, oh, by the way, do you happen to have a picture of my book in your store? Because I've never seen my book on the shelf in a bookstore. Which on one level was incredible to me because we've been open in Dallas now since May 1st in some limited capacity, but there's just no walk-in traffic right now at the bookstores near you, I guess.
No, and I mean, I've actually done readings that are to support some of our local bookstores, City Lights and Point Reyes Books, and no, we're not there yet. We're having a gentler surge, not a huge spike, but it hasn't felt appropriate. One of the things I actually wrote about in the book, in one of the poems, is my husband had a pretty terrible pneumonia a few years ago, and it was pretty dangerous. And so we've been really cautious, you know, I mean, also my parents live nearby and I'd really love to hang out with them. And, you know, it would be, there's so many possible avenues of tragedy in this moment. So we're just being careful.
That sounds smart. Do you find that you are having more time to write in these days, or less? And right, I guess I should ask.
I feel, well, no, after 2 projects, I think I would just be a little like kind of listening for the emergence of new things. I'm working towards having a play produced, and so I'm working on Zoom readings for that. So that's kind of, I know it's really, it's totally tender, new thing. But you know what's funny? Just the last couple of weeks, these little small, almost poems of miniature started to come little by little into the notebook, and you know, I started to sense a kind of like a pulse or a pattern, and just I'm trying not to, you know, I'm trying to just kind of like, it's like luring a big fish in. You don't want to, like, you know, jump too soon or move. In fact, maybe I shouldn't even tell you about it. But yeah, the feeling of the stimuli sometimes of like the world that I used to be zooming around the world, and now it's very much more an enclosed space. But I think I would start to write slowly no matter what. Like I would just, this was almost the work of a decade. So, you know, to kind of reset my mind and figure out, look in the notebooks and read some books I've been meaning to read. I'm reading Neruda, I'm reading Merwin, the wonderful poet Evan Boland, who passed earlier this spring. So that's for me, like the tender little starts. Should we read some more poems?
You should, definitely.
Okay.
I was going to suggest that.
I want to just read just a couple from the middle of this book, Rift Zone. And and then maybe one from the Lang, and I don't know. I think we could see where we are then. Song with poppies and reverie. Song with poppies and reverie. 30 years later, my body grown, flickering signal economy, also fire poppies in the lava garden, clumsy arthropods, fat pollinators, equal in mystery, I am a mother. What does it mean to belong to July? Blackberry, thistle, nectarine, shadow, how have I survived even this life? At street corners, sometimes time hauls me under like the stone guzzle where the land's crust subducts into sea. At the bay, encampment, dispossessed, dispossessed. Sometimes in my mind, ghost okies still clatter uphill in ghost Model Ts. Rosie the riveters smoke in post-war sun. At the corner, Hap Taylor. The Y fallen, hapless. A lizard runs by. At the beach yesterday, I heard 7 languages, corvid and seal bark. Last year, they tore down the last town trailer park. A stream gutters under my house. A stream follows the path of a fault line. Our gravestones are signposts to everywhere. Yun Kobayashi Menendez Revere. The Sunset Mausoleum welcomes all visitors. The backhoe inters the Arrivist dead. What's the name of the stream in Wichin Ohlone? The question lingers. Oyster clouds open. Our coastlines are swallowed, are hollowed like vowels. And I want to read a short one that I wrote just after the birth of my daughter. It's called Emmeline at 6 weeks. You howl all vowel. When you babble, your elocution is clear as a downhill stream. With the eyes of a prophet, you gaze beyond us, and when you cry, your wail is tremendous. You stage revolution on behalf of the stars.
I really love that one. That's beautiful.
Yeah. What if I read a little section of Last West and then a goodbye poem? Should we do that? How does that feel?
That feels good.
Cool. I just wanted to read a little bit of Last West because it had the ghost Okies climbing up the hill in their ghost Model Ts. And I thought I would just read the opening section of Last West. And you can see it's like really interesting on the page. It's like lists. This is Dorothea Lange's notebook. Anyway, here are the ghost Okies. They're still doing it. They're still clattering up the hill in their ghost Model Ts. And here they are in the Imperial Valley, which we talked about earlier. Lori, it's been so great to talk to you. This is so fun. Imperial Valley, 1935 and more. And we're in Dorothea Lange's notebook now. Road Songs, her 1935 notebook, Coachella, Calipatria, Neyland, Holtville, Calexico, El Centro, Brawley, Back Up 99, Edison, Tulare, Turlock, Modesto, Wesley, La Loma, Marysville, her scrawl, Date Palms near Mecca, a desert method. 1935, single man. You can't find any decent pace unless you play good money. What difference, what country, what state, what agency? Question. What does it mean to photograph home? 1935, families of squatters along a side road, all have house cars, get water at service station. Crops, lettuces, melons, carrots, peas, cantaloupe, potatoes, apricots, peaches, berries, alfalfa, beans, cherries, sugar beets. Man, how are you going to get by on just $2 a day? Cotton, 3 men, 20 cents, half a row, $2 a day. Potatoes, no better. Man, wife, and kid, onions, $1.60. Hay job, 25 cents an hour. Imperial Valley, more refugees outside. 1937, man, if we had anything to go back for. 1937, Skid Row. This also is California. 2019. Today's paper, Climate Change Affecting Coffee Groves of Honduras. 1937, man, I wouldn't undertake to farm this land no more. Abandoned houses, abandoned soil, the government camp, the trading center, Main Street in Marysville, cabin for rent, Graflex number 1, note to self, get wide angle lens.
That was great.
Isn't she fun? I mean, it's just like that. And so this having this fun collage of her beautiful ear, and then thinking, okay, well, we're still doing that, you know. I mean, I guess a hijab pays more than 25 cents an hour, but that question of how to keep us sustained, you know.
It almost when you were reading it, the rhythm of it, it almost felt like it could be like a Broadway musical. Like I could see some people dancing, you know, in old timey clothes. And
you know what's funny? There's a playwright who I actually wrote a play, but there's a different playwright who wants to maybe work towards like making a staged version of a book of poetry. And you know what's so funny? What a weird set of delightful things, you know, like the Museum of Modern Art wants a book of poetry, and then maybe somebody wants to do a staged version of a book of poetry. I'm always flattered because, of course, as poets, we just think that we're like alone, and it's always wonderful to feel like we've connected. In fact, I wanted to say to you, you can find me, you can connect with me on Twitter or Instagram or even by my website. If you write a note that doesn't sound hostile or a little bit, you know, wildly unhinged, I generally love to write back to people who write to me. So if this is work that means something to you, or you want to share, you want a signed copy for your aunt who happens to live in La Loma, California, all these things are good. So you should be in touch. I'm at Tessathon on Twitter and findable other ways as well. I wanted to end, yesterday I took my kids blackberry picking, and I took them because I've had them all summer. We have a rotating pod of moving the kids, a couple of families between these families, and the kids are happier than were when we were alone and during the real lockdown. But we're all doing these things that are so kind of like remembering every game we were ever taught in childhood, and like trying to remember every art project we ever loved at summer camp. And my kids actually played marbles in the driveway yesterday, and I was like, this is year 1943. It was so sweet. It was really sweet.
Were they your marbles, or did you buy new ones?
Well, no, we got a set of like a marble run, but then, oh my gosh, this elderly lady down the block had a really cool old school marble run in her garage, and I walked up and I said, oh, I remember loving that one when I was a kid. Are you cleaning out your garage right now? Because she looked like she was. And she said, I wouldn't part with that, but I would really love to loan it to a neighbor. It's a hard time.
Aw, that's so lovely.
I know. I borrowed a marble run from a neighbor, and we set it up in the driveway, and my kids played marbles in the driveway. And for that sweetness, I am grateful. And so also for the sweetness of blackberry picking. And in fact, I'm going to just close with this poem called Song with Wild Plum and Thorn. The morning is cold and the world is hard, but even in fog, it is still midsummer. The kids need to play and the grocery budget ticks towards nothing the way the world tips towards doomsday. The walls in my chest will not let me breathe, and all the screens flicker and still answer nothing. So I take the children down to the bike path, and with buckets and a few blessed hours, wander a corridor of weedy fruit. Blackberry, wild plum, all overhung, we leaners or gleaners, half acrobatic, lost among boughs, alone till I notice others stopping with buckets or tiffins in many languages along these tracks, picking what weeds we still hold in common as dry heat builds and fog thins. In common, the thought feels strangely radical, crumb or bloom beyond loneliness. For a while I feel entirely animal, little forager hungry for fruit, black sparkle, pale pit and thorn, weeds binding some world together. A word appears in my mind, hold fast, sprout, raw volunteer. For a while it is hand to mouth and to bucket, breathing, still here, still here. Thank you.
Thank you, Tess. It was lovely to speak with you today.
Really a joy, Lori. I hope things are going well at the store, and thank you for including me in your chats and risking a little time for poetry. I feel like people should always risk a little bit, and then they'll get hooked and they'll discover it's, they want to risk a little more. So, yeah.
It was a delight. Thank you.
Bye now.